Project Arise. We wanted to let you know that we are happy that you are here. It's been a long year, and there's a lot of us that are looking forward to those next steps. And this is the perfect time to have NCII talk to us about database interventions. And we have John Potter here from NCII. I'd like to welcome him, and thank you all for being here.
All right, thank you, Nicole. Well, welcome everyone. Again, my name is John Potter. Today, we're going to talk about using data to design and adapt interventions for our kids with the most intensive needs. But just to kind of get us kick-started here, I know we already kind of put names and roles in the chat here, but another fun kind of activity icebreaker I've been using lately is this one. So just put like, what are you looking forward to this summer? Like, we're real close to summer. I always like hearing about all the fun activities people have going on. So what are you looking forward to this summer? Yeah, sunshine. Yeah, free concerts in the park, always great. Yeah, love live music. Reading at the beach. Oh, nice trip to South Africa. Awesome. Yeah, camping. Yes. I miss camping. I've got my kids are a little bit too little to enjoy camping, but another year or two. Beach. Oh, Kenya. Nice. Yeah, awesome. Lots of fun things. All right. Well, I'm similar. I'm looking forward to just being outside, enjoying sunshine, spend time with the family, going to the farmer's market. Lots of good stuff happening. So, all right. So, just some quick introductions, a little bit of my background, who I am. So, my name is John Potter. I am currently located in Portland, Oregon, and I provide technical assistance for the National Center on Intensive Intervention, which I'll talk a little bit about that organization in a second here. But prior to that work, I've been with NCII for a couple of years now almost, but I worked for 13 years in Oregon as a statewide implementation coach around early literacy multi-tiered systems. So a project called Oregon Response to Instruction and Intervention. So we work with school districts all across the state of Oregon to build early literacy systems that support all students, including our students with the most intensive needs that I'm going to focus on today. So my background, RTI, MTSS, a lot around literacy instruction, database decision-making, and school culture. So that's kind of where I'm coming from and my background. But currently I'm with the National Center on Intensive Intervention. So if you're familiar with NCII, we are a federally funded center that really focuses on how do we prepare educators, leaders, both local and state leaders, as well as national leaders, professional development providers, folks in higher education, a wide range of folks to really support and implement intensive interventions for our students that need that most intensive level of support. So kids with pretty significant learning needs around social, emotional, behavioral, as well as academic needs. So how do we put that all together? And that's done through a process of data-based individualization, which I'll talk a little bit about what that is. Couple just housekeeping things. Just, we've got a small group here, so just make sure to stay on mute when you're not speaking. If you do have a question, you can use the chat box to ask that. I'll be happy to address those as they come in if I see them. Otherwise, we'll also have some time at the end for questions as well. But if you want to come off mute, you hear something you want to respond to, you are also welcome to do that as well. It's helpful to me if your camera is on, but very much not required. I get it. It's the end of the day. You may have other things going on. Feel free to turn that camera off if that's how you want to engage in this. So don't feel any pressure to do that. And then there's a URL for the resources there. I know Nicole put the link in the chat there as well, so you can access it through the chat as well. So these slides will be in there, and all the resources I talk about are all linked on the slides, so you can access those. All right. So as we kind of get started here, maybe another thing just in the chat, when we talk about DBI, database individualization, on a 0 to 3 scale, what's your familiarity with DBI? So 0 being none, don't even know what DBI stands for, versus 3, we're implementing it, we're doing it pretty well. we feel pretty confident about it. So what's your familiarity when I say DBI? Some twos, some ones, two. So a little bit of familiarity for folks. Yeah, so it sounds familiar. Okay. Um, great. Well, you don't necessarily for this presentation have to have a deep understanding of it. I'll kind of talk a little bit at the beginning, give you an overview of what it is and the big picture, and then we'll kind of dive in a little bit deeper with some of those components around DBI. All right. So today, really what we're going to talk about is within the DBI framework, how do we evaluate and adapt our instruction, the curriculum, and the environmental supports that we provide for our students who have those most intensive level of needs? So what is the process for doing that? How can we use data to drive all of that? All right. So DBI, what is DBI? So here's kind of an overview of what it is. So it is a process first and foremost. It is not a curriculum. It is not a one size fits all model, but it is a process and a set of questions that we walk through to really individualize and intensify. And that process integrates evidence-based interventions, assessments, and instructional and behavioral strategies. So it takes what we know about through research about how we assess and identify needs of students and matches it with our best research around what is going to work for students with the most intensive needs. And so DBI is a 5-step process, which we have this graphic that kind of walks through that. But in general, this is what it generally looks like. So the first step is we have students that may be identified as at risk or students that are needing a little bit more support. And usually that's done through a screening process. And we want to deliver a validated intervention program with fidelity. So for reading, for example, we know, especially in early grade levels, we have a lot of really great literacy interventions that will work pretty effectively when matched to need and deliver with fidelity. So we want to start off with some of those great programs that we have that have an evidence and research base behind them. Once we do that, we're going to monitor progress. So we're going to assess kids with really brief, quick assessments. We're really talking like 1 minute, 2 minute assessments on a weekly or bi-weekly basis to really figure out, are kids responding to those interventions? Are our interventions having the intended effect, and are kids making progress towards reaching grade level goals? For some students, they're going to respond to that, and we're going to be able to fade or remove those interventions. But for some students, they're going to need more. They're not going to respond to those initial interventions. And so those last 3 steps are really what do we do when we find those students that need some additional support? And so today we're really going to focus on this steps 3 and 4 here in the process about how do we collect diagnostic data to develop a hypothesis around why. Why is our student not responding to interventions? We have these really good evidence-based reading interventions that many of our students respond to and they can have great success with, but some students will not. And so we want to know why that is, because that's going to allow us to really figure out how do we adapt that intervention to meet the needs of these particular students that need some additional support. And so we'll talk about what that looks like today, and I'll share a number of resources that we have to help guide that. But really, when I think about this process, I always think about in schools, it makes me think of this, right? And this is this big gap that we're really always trying to bridge for some of our students. And the idea is, on one side of this gap, we have a student that is non-responsive to our interventions. We're delivering high quality, explicit instruction matched to their need in an environment that is conducive to learning. And some students don't respond to that. And so our question is then, we want to have an effective plan that's going to work for that kid. And when we see this gap, sometimes it's larger than we would like it to be. And sometimes we just kind of run and jump from one side to the other. And we hope that we get to the other side, right? We have a student that's non-responsive and we just kind of guess at things. We say, oh, well, we've got this other program, or maybe we do this, or, this has worked for some other kids. But it's not really a data-informed process. It's not really a good way to get from point A to point B. And this is what it can kind of feel like, right? It's like we're just kind of holding on for dear life, hoping that something's going to work. But really, we want to get to a point where we're using data to really look at all the reasons why a student might be experiencing challenges and dig a little bit deeper to figure out what we're going to do to address those needs. And so I like to use this analogy when I talk about this piece of bridging the gap from knowing that there's a problem that we need to address versus being able to have a solution. And so I use the analogy of a goldfish. And so I want you to think of, like, if you have a goldfish or have had a goldfish, or you have kids that have a goldfish, think about if, for example, that goldfish maybe was not as healthy as you would like it to be. Maybe it's swimming a little oddly in the bowl. Maybe it doesn't look like it's doing well, but something's wrong with that goldfish. Something is up. And I want you to just put in the chat real quick, what are some of the questions that you might ask, or some of the things that you might think of why that goldfish doesn't appear to be healthy? So what are all the variables that you might look at or ask? So just go ahead and put those in the chat real quick. Yeah, Melissa, is it underfed, overfed? Am I feeding it the right amount? Yeah, the water. Is the water too dirty? Does it have limited activity? Is the right pH balance in the water? Yeah, not enough space. Maybe the bowl's too small. Maybe we're not feeding it the right food. Other things that we might consider, maybe there's certain fish that should not be in the same bowl together because they just don't cohabitate all that well. Yeah, temperature of the water. Yep, that's another good one. Is it too hot? Is it too cold? Yeah, so those are all things, right, that we ask, and that's where our mind immediately jumps when we think about, like, a goldfish that's not healthy. We think about all those things around the goldfish that we could change to make that goldfish more healthy. But a lot of the times in schools, when we have students that are not doing well, we immediately tend to jump to the question of what's wrong with that student, right? We blame the student, or we blame the families. Well, that student might have a learning disability, or that student just isn't motivated, or that student just isn't getting it. And so when we think about problem solving, we think about this database individualization process, we need to use this analogy of the goldfish, and we need to think through, why do students experience challenges? It's probably because of something around them that is not balanced to what they need. Just like a fish will be healthy with the right amount of food. It'll be healthy with the right temperature of water, the right pH balance, the right environment. We want to look at all the things around our students that make them successful. And so when we talk about, like, we have a problem because a student isn't successful, that problem, it's important to understand that problem is not inherent in the child or their family. That problem is a problem of a match between our systems and what we're providing and what that student currently needs. Because every student, most students will be okay with what you generally provide for all students, but some students are going to need more. And in general, like, we all need more of something, right? We all have things that we're not good at that we need more help with. So there's nothing wrong with that. But we want to look at problems are a problem of the fit of what we're providing versus what students need. So the problem solving is really about solving the problems in our systems, not solving the problems that are inherent with the kids. And so when we think about, this analogy of the goldfish, we want to think about all the things around students that can make them successful. And so I'm going to talk about this idea of the instruction, the curriculum, and the environment. These are the variables, what we call the alterable variables, that we have control over, that have an immense impact on the outcomes for kids. We know the quality of instruction, the quality of the instructional environment, the skills that we're teaching in the curriculum. There's a lot of evidence and research to say, all kids can be successful if we find the right levels of these things to provide for kids and the right appropriate match and fit for our students. And so when we think about what are we talking about when we talk about instruction, curriculum, environment, what does that mean? And so some examples of that are, we know we want to provide explicit instruction to our students, right? We want to have a quick pace of instruction, lots of opportunities for kids to respond, a high level of corrective feedback. We want to engage in culturally relevant pedagogy that honors and values what kids bring to the table. We want to engage them as part of that instructional partnership. And so all of these things are things that we can change, that we have control over, that if we find the right balance of these, kids can be successful. Same with curriculum. Do we have the right scope and sequence? Are we teaching at the right level of difficulty for a student? Are we teaching the right skills? A student who has basic decoding issues, and we're trying to teach them to be more fluent, readers to read more quickly, we're really just teaching them to read fast with a lot of errors. We need to match that to the level of need to make sure we're fixing those decoding issues that they're experiencing. We also want to look at high quality materials. Are they culturally relevant? So again, these are things that we have control over that we can change to make sure we're finding the right fit for our students, especially our students with the most intensive needs. And then with environment, we want to have things like clear expectations for our kids. We want to have positive interactions, positive engagement, inclusive classrooms. These are all things, again, that impact kids very highly. And if we don't have the right fit, we don't have the right balance. We're not providing a lot of feedback to kids, positive feedback for our students. We're going to see some challenges. We would expect that kids might experience challenge when we don't have the right balance for these things. And so as we think about how we address, look at what variables we can change and then match them to an intervention that's going to work, we want to think through this lens. And so a resource that you can use, I'm not going to go into depth with this one, but again, these are all linked in there, is this idea of, this acronym soup of ISIL and RIOT. So, we need acronyms in education. We have lots of acronyms. We always need more. But the idea is this kind of guides what type of information we want to look at and how might we collect it to really look at diagnostically, what can we do to support our students with the most intensive needs? And so ISIL stands for instruction, curriculum, environment, and learner. And then RIOT is how we collect that data. We can review, we can interview, we can observe, and we can test. So we could observe the instruction, we could observe the environment, and there's examples on this form of how you might do that, or things that you might be looking for. I could learn more about the instruction by interviewing the teacher and asking them about their instructional strategies. I could interview the learner. I could interview the learner's family to learn about their challenges and their successes and their strengths and their perspective on all of this. And so the idea is when a student struggles, what we tend to do is we tend to live in this far bottom box here where we test the learner, right? We have a student that's not making progress and we give them assessments. We give them tests to really break down what do they need. And that's a piece of the puzzle. We want to know what their skills are, but learning, again, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in an instructional environment. It happens in response to a curriculum. It happens with, within a classroom or within a school setting. So we want to make sure that we understand the context of the learning, not just the learning, because you could have two students with the same pattern of performance and pattern of skills that have very different needs. So if I have, for example, a third grader who doesn't have basic decoding skills, can't even identify a letter, and they haven't had any instruction their academic career or have very little, they have a very different need than a student has had 3 years of solid explicit instruction and it's still not clicking for them. Those are two very different kids. If we just test the learner, all we're going to see is the outcome, but we don't see the inputs of what we're actually doing to get those outcomes. And so within this process, we really need to take a look at those inputs. And mainly, this is a process where we are reflective of our systems because it is changing adult behavior and adult systems that's going to have the greatest impact on the outcomes for our kids, because all kids can be successful if given the right level of support and given the right balance of instruction, curriculum, and environment. Right. So we think about bridging this gap then, really, I'm going to talk through this process of step by step. What we want to do is we want to first look at what existing data or information do we have. So what do we already know about the instruction, the curriculum, the environment, and the learner? Do we do walkthroughs of instruction? Do we know what that instructional interaction looks like? Do we know what intervention program or what curriculum they're receiving, what skills they're getting? Do we know if we have, for example, a behavior support system or a motivational system in place? We want to know, start by looking at what we already know, because that's going to allow us to start to develop a hypothesis around, well, we think this student is experiencing challenges because of this. So again, if I know that the student has received very little to no instruction over several years, my hypothesis is probably that they're not successful because they haven't had the dosage or quality of instruction that students would typically need to be successful. That's not an inherent problem in the kid. They just have not had the opportunity to learn because instruction has not been provided. And so once we develop the hypothesis, we're going to collect some additional data to really kind of dig in and confirm or disconfirm, like, is that what's really going on, or are there other factors at play? And that's going to allow us to develop a plan. And so something along the lines of, we know that the student will be successful if we do this. So if I know that the student hasn't had a lot of effective explicit instruction, the programs that they've had thus far are not explicit, haven't really given them the opportunity to practice those skills with enough depth, my hypothesis would be that that's what they need, and we're going to create a plan that's going to provide that for that student. And so when we look at this, the first place I would start, though, is before we start rolling out new programs, new practices, and all this, is being reflective around what have we already done, and have we actually implemented the things that we said we have. And so it's going back to this idea of fidelity. And I know fidelity can be a bad word in schools. It's the educational F word. We don't want to talk about it. And so I don't mean fidelity that it's lockstep, we deliver a program regardless of how the kids are responding. But we know a lot of these evidence-based programs work with most kids if we deliver them as they were designed. And so when I think of fidelity, the way that I break it down, try to break it down pretty simply, is there's a couple of different general questions we want to know. The first is, did we deliver that intervention? And so the idea, are we providing the program as designed? Are we giving it sufficient time? So I've seen a lot of schools where they get a program that's designed, for example, for 45 minutes, and we deliver it for 30 minutes a day. That's not really delivering with fidelity. And if it's not working, it's not working possibly because we're not actually being able to do all of it in the way that it's supposed to be done. So are we doing it as designed with sufficient time, but are we also doing it in a high quality way? And you've probably all seen a multitude of really great intervention programs. I've seen a lot of great explicit instructional, direct instructional programs, many of which have pretty significant guidance or scripts built into them. And the scripts aren't necessarily to be like a lockstep, like how you always say these words and nothing else, but it's meant to guide you to minimize your instructional language. But I've seen the same program be delivered in two ways, to where if you're just saying, are they following the program? I would say both ways they're following the program. But in one, they're just reading the script. There's no excitement in there. There's no deviation from that. And it's really just like frustrating and boring to sit in there and watch that instruction. Versus I've seen the same program delivered, and it is exhilarating. It is exciting because the teacher's excited about, the kids are excited about, they're adding to it. Both deliver with fidelity, but one in a high quality way, one in a low quality way. So we want to go beyond just, did I do the program, but did I do it well in a high quality way? And so that's the first piece of fidelity. The second piece is, did the student receive the intervention? And this goes to the idea of attendance. And so if kids aren't attending regularly, it doesn't matter how high quality that instructional delivery is, because they're not receiving it. It sounds obvious, but I once heard someone say, kids don't benefit from interventions they don't receive. And so if they're not showing up, fixing the intervention delivery is not going to change anything. If they're not showing up to the intervention, we want to look at, how do we engage kids and their families, and how do we get them to attend more regularly? How do we build that partnership with our kids and our families? But at the very least, we want to ask these questions to make sure whatever we've done at those initial intervention stages, we've delivered it with fidelity, we've delivered it with high quality, and the kids are actually attending and receiving that intervention. And there's different ways to assess fidelity. You can do that through observation checklists. You can do that through self-report. You can have folks fill out something on themselves just to make sure, am I doing all the components? You can look at permanent products, make sure they're actually like doing the writing activities that are in there. But we don't want to get too caught up on making sure that we're doing fidelity just because we're measuring it for an evaluative purpose. We're really looking at fidelity because we want to make sure the kids are getting the supports that they need to receive. And so as we think about that, then once we know or have a good idea that kids have actually received the interventions that we've provided in a high quality way, we want to start looking at some questions about why students might not be making progress, might not be successful, and start to develop some hypotheses. So here's a couple of ways that we might, examples of how we might think through this. And so if I look at a student and I find that a student is making little to no progress, they're unsuccessful in the intervention. And so what does this look like? It looks like if you're collecting progress monitoring data, you've probably seen those students that are completely flatlined. They make almost no progress or very little. They don't do well in the intervention setting, so they don't pass intervention checkouts. They have behaviors in the intervention. They don't pay attention. They don't engage. They're inaccurate in their responding in the intervention. If that's the case, my hypothesis might be that this is really a mismatch between what this student needs in terms of the skills and what we're teaching. And so if I think that that's the case, I want to dive a little bit deeper and start to see what are the skills we're teaching in the curriculum, and do they match what the student needs? And so here's some things to think about. We know that within literacy and early literacy in particular, there are different areas of reading. To be a proficient reader, you need to have a multitude of skills. And so some of those are displayed here. We know there's the word recognition side and the language comprehension side. All are important for our kids to be successful. And so when we talk about interventions, oftentimes interventions will focus on one or more of these because we want to match the need to the instructional package that we're delivering. And so if we know that students lack basic decoding or phonemic awareness skills, we want to intervene on that because we know that those can create a bottleneck to some of those high order skills. If kids can't read the words on the page, they're never going to be able to comprehend and understand or read fluently, or some of those other higher order thinking skills. And so we want to match kids to those right areas of reading within the intervention. So kid that has a phonics C, we're going to provide a phonics intervention. But we also need to start to think a little bit deeper than that as well. And so I want to talk about this idea of the instructional hierarchy. And so I want you to think about, for this, think about when you learned to drive, and think about like what car you had, where you did it, who taught you, what was that process like? And so as you think through that, you might recall like, working the steering wheel, working the gas. If you learned on a manual transmission, you had to work the clutch, you had to work the gearbox. Like there's a lot, right, to go on. And it's hard at first because you have to keep all that in your brain. You have to put multiple skills together and do it pretty automatically. And so at this first level of learning how to drive, you're at this stage called the acquisition stage. And so this is a hierarchy of learning anything. The first thing we need to do when we learn something is we need to focus on it heavily and learn how to just do it accurately, right? We have to get all those steps. We have to know where my hand goes. We have to know where my feet goes. We have to know where my eyes go. You have to do those things accurately, because if you don't do those things accurately, you won't be able to make it to the next stage. And so the next stage is this idea of building fluency and automaticity. So once you're able to do all those things pretty accurately, you don't have to think about them anymore. Think about the last time you drove. Like, did you think consciously about like how heavy your foot was on the gas pedal or brake, or where your hand was going on the gearbox, or did you have your hands at 10 and 2? Maybe, maybe not, but you probably didn't think about it because you don't have to. Like, you're accurate and you're fluent at it. You can free up your cognitive attention to do other things, like pay attention to the traffic a little bit more. You can put on a GPS, you could listen to music, you could eat, you could do a wide variety of things. Yeah, so thinking like, Laura, the executive function, your working memory, is going to be freed up to do a lot of those more skills, those higher level skills, rather than have to focus on those basic, functions that you're doing. And so at this stage is where many of our kids, one of these two stages, are going to need intervention. But what we want to do is we want kids to move beyond these stages into these higher order stages. So the next stage is this idea of generalization. This is, with the car analogy, think about the last time you rented a car or drove a car that was not yours. That car is different, right? Like, it's got all the things. It's still got a steering wheel, still got, gas pedal, brake pedal. It's got a stereo, it's got all the air, windows, all of that, but it's a little bit different. I just had a car. I was traveling and I rented a car, and they gave me an electric car. And I've never driven an electric car before. Um, and it's pretty much the same. It's still a car, right? Like it's still pretty similar, but there's some differences in where the knobs are and where the buttons are. Like it takes a little while to figure out how the lights go, how the wipers go. Like it works a little bit differently. But once we have acquisition and fluency, we can start to generalize. And so thinking about kids and reading skills, like they accurately decode words and then they can read them fluently. And then they can start to generalize across text to text that has different fonts, to text that has a multitude of words in it. It's not just the words that they've been taught. And ideally, like where we want to go is to the stage of adaptation. And I will say, though, in terms of driving, like and operating a vehicle, this is not a stage that all of us go to. I am certainly not at this stage because this is where you modify skills to new settings. And so, in the analogy of driving, this would be: can you drive a semi truck? Can you drive a boat? Can you drive an ATV? Can you ride a bicycle? You can probably do some of those things. They're all vehicles, they're all similar, but it's a little bit different. You have to adapt to do those things. And so for our kids in reading, we want to look at when we have kids that are experiencing challenges, what stage of the instructional hierarchy are they on? It's not just enough to say, oh, this kid needs a phonics intervention, let's give him phonics, or this kid needs oral language support, let's give him oral language. What stage are they at? Are they at that acquisition stage where they still need to learn, just be accurate at those sounds or accurate at identifying what those words mean? Or can they start to be fluent, and can you start to practice and start to speed that up a little bit so they're automatic with it? Not fast for the sake of being fast, but automaticity is where we're trying to go with that. And so we have a resource that's available. It's linked in here, just an infographic that kind of guides, that instructional hierarchy piece. And then just give some examples of like instructional strategies and how you might approach a kid who's at that acquisition stage versus fluency versus generalization and adaptation. So that's a resource for later. All right. So the next piece to think about then is instruction. And so why might I think that the instruction might be a reason that students might be experiencing challenges? And so this is a little bit different because for this, you might have some of those kids where you see that they're fairly successful in the intervention. They do pretty well during that time that they get reading intervention. They pass checkouts. Their behavior is pretty great. They're engaged. They enjoy it. But you have those kids that where they make progress, but it never seems to be enough, right? Like their progress monitoring graph, they're going up, they're making progress, but they never seem to really catch up. And so for students that have that experience, what we say is it might be the intensity of instruction that they're just not getting enough of that intervention. We need more of that intervention. And so the difference between this and the curriculum piece is a kid who's flatlined, I don't want them to get more of that. That's not working. Like we need something different. A kid who's making progress, but it's not enough, we need more of that. So how do we get more of that intervention to that student? And so what I might do then is I might go and look at, observe and take a look at that instruction and see, are we teaching with explicit instruction routines? Are they getting lots of opportunities to respond? How's the corrective feedback? And I'll give some examples of what that looks like. And so the first piece we might look at is this idea of opportunities to respond. And this is a powerful one. I always remember I went to a conference where we had a keynote speaker that said, if I had $10 to invest in education, I would invest 9 of it in opportunities to respond. And what she wasn't saying wasn't about like money necessarily, but it's the idea of like, where do we want to spend our time and focus? And we know that there are a lot of different things in education. There are a lot of programs, there are a lot of practices. There's a lot that goes into our teaching our students. But at the very basic level, teaching and learning is all about doing something, doing a skill, doing it right, and getting feedback if you're wrong and correcting your mistakes. And it's that practice of doing something over and over again. That's how we get good at anything, right? That's how we get good at sports. That's how we get good at, playing an instrument. That's how we get good at our hobbies. It's practice. And so instructional opportunities to respond is really about practice. And so what it is, it's any behavior that requires a response and followed by feedback. And so there's different ways to provide these opportunities to respond to our students. So the first thing to think about is who's going to respond? Who are we providing these opportunities to? And so we can do these in a number of ways, especially in early literacy instruction. We provide a lot of choral response. So we have our students, say sounds together. So class, tell me all the sounds in sad, and they'll segment out those sounds. Or we'll show a word and we'll have all the students blend that word together. So choral response is one way to do it. But we also think about other ways like partner responses. And this, I think, is another highly underutilized strategy in education. I see a lot of, especially in whole group instruction, where we're asking a question and we're saying, well, who can tell me this? Who can tell me all the sounds in this word? Who can segment this? What you get is you get some kids raising their hands, and the kids that typically raise their hand are not the kids that need the extra practice. But what you could do instead is have kids tell their partner that. So tell your partner all the sounds in sad. That way you get all the kids engaging and thinking about that rather than just one kid raising his hand and thinking about it and the rest of the kids doing, who knows what. So there's partner responses, there's core responses, and then there's individual responses. Sometimes we want to call on individual kids and get lots of individual turns. And so when we have students that are not being successful, sometimes we want to go and take a look. Are we just giving a lot of core response where that kid is actually not responding? They're echoing. How do we build in more opportunities to respond for those students that need additional opportunities? Because some kids will be fine with very few. Some kids will learn a skill in 3 to 5 practice opportunities. Some kids are going to need more. And so the question is, how do we build in for the kids that need more? But we also want to think about different ways to engage kids. It's not just about verbal responses. We can also have kids write things, and especially with reading, we know the writing-reading connection is important. Kids who can write and spell are better readers. And so we want kids to be writing a lot. So writing on whiteboards, write all the sounds in sad. Or, write a definition of the word angry. We want to have kids actively engaged in writing. And then we can have action responses too. So this is a good one when we talk about like vocabulary, kids learning vocabulary words. So, if you want kids to know what a word means, have them act it out. Like, kids, show me what angry means. Kids, show me what desperate looks like. Like, have them act it out to show you those things. That's another way to kind of get kids responding and engaging in a multitude of ways. But again, opportunities to respond is another way to kind of intensify instruction for kids that need it. And the thing about opportunities to respond is it's free, right? You don't have to pay anything. You don't have to buy a new program, and you may not be able to build in more time to your schedule, but you can probably get more opportunities to respond built into the amount of time that you have. And so when we talk about opportunities to respond, we always get asked this question, how much? How many opportunities should we be getting for kids? And there's some general guidance, but it's not hard and fast. But in general, this is what we're seeing, based on the research. And so there's a little bit of context here, right? Like different activities will get different opportunities to respond. So for example, if we're having a deeper discussion about a rich text, you're not going to get a high rate of responding because those responses are going to be longer and more in depth. But we know our kids with the most intensive needs are going to need the most opportunities to respond. So we're talking like 10 minutes or 10 opportunities per minute on average. But again, learning is all about doing something, doing it correctly enough times to get that moved from your working memory to your long-term memory. And so for some people, they need more opportunities. And so for some kids who maybe haven't had a lot of good instruction over the few years, they've lost a lot of opportunities. They've lost a couple of years of getting those. So how do we build those back in? How do we accelerate that by providing more opportunities given the time that we have? And so all of this occurs within a explicit instructional sequence. And I kind of touched on this, but this idea of I do, you do, you do. So first we model, my turn, the word is sat. And then we guide students in practicing that, do it with me. The word is sat. And then ideally we have them independently do it. So sound it out. And so if we have a student that's experiencing challenge, I want to know, like, are they getting this instructional sequence? Or are we just doing, what I see sometimes in classroom is it's not even I do, we do, you do. It's I do, I do, I do, I do, I do, I do. I'll see you kids tomorrow. Like kids don't even have a chance to practice or engage anything. And so we want to make sure that we're having the sequence. And in terms of intensifying instruction or adapting, it's not more I do. You don't need to model it. You don't need to model that skill more. What you need is more we do, more guided practice to do it with the kids because it gives them more opportunities to respond. And then on top of that, we have the opportunity for corrective feedback because every time students make a mistake, we can correct that by providing the correct response. We don't need to harp on the incorrect response or make students feel bad for making mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. Mistakes are another opportunity to learn and respond. And so we take advantage of that by going back to the beginning of the sequence. And so the question is then, if you have kids that are experiencing difficulty and not being successful, they're making some progress, but not enough. We have another resource here that you can use. But have you ever gone in and actually counted the number of opportunities to respond? And sometimes you'll be surprised at what you find. Sometimes kids don't get a lot of opportunities to respond. They sit and they listen to the teacher a lot, but there's not a lot of active engagement. And so are we getting 1 to 2 a minute, or are we getting that 9 to 10 a minute that kids with really intensive needs and intensive interventions are going to need? So that's instruction. And then the last one, before I give a chance to kind of reflect a little bit, I want to talk about environment. And so why might I think the environment might be playing a part in the students' difficulties? And so this is where we see, and this is another common pattern, you might see students that are doing okay in some settings, but they don't do okay in other settings. So kids that do okay in that intervention, but they don't seem to ever take that back to the classroom and apply what they learned in the classroom. So for example, I'm teaching a multisyllabic decoding word routine. They get it when they're in the intervention, then they go back to class, they come to a multisyllabic word and they can't sound it out. So if that's the case, my hypothesis might be that it's a transfer issue. They're not generalizing or transferring those skills. Or it could also be a classroom management issue. It could be how we're managing different contexts and making sure kids are successful across those contexts. So if that's the case, I want to take a look and observe how the student does and what instruction looks like across those settings. And so we think about like behavior supports and how we support our kids and their social and emotional well-being. We want to think about the interactions that we provide for our students and how we provide a positive environment for our kids. And so this is based on research that's been done. And what they generally found, like in one of these studies, was they observed for 5 hours and they found that 40% of what teachers did was ask kids to do something. Like it was questions or directives, sound this out, put this away, do this, whatever it was. And in an hour, on average, kids got about 2.5 praise statements. They got told good job or thank you or I appreciate that 2.5 times an hour. That's frustrating. But that's typical. And so what the instructional sequence typically look like in classrooms is the teacher would request something, they'd ask the kids to do something, students would complete that. That would get followed by another request. And so think about in your role, and we have this in our job sometimes where I get asked to do something, I do it, I get asked to do another thing, I do it, I get asked to do another thing, I do it. And it's just this continual like treadmill of like, I do stuff, I never really get acknowledged for that I did it correctly. I don't even know if I did it correctly. I just keep getting asked to do things. And so what we'd rather see is a sequence where we request something, the student does it, and then we acknowledge them. Thank you for doing that. Yes, that's correct. Yes, I appreciate you putting that away for me. Like treating your students like in a way that you would want to be treated and valued as people. And so we think about like this idea of reinforcement acknowledgement is powerful in terms of learning outcomes. Yeah, a good question, Nicole. So 2.5 generally per classroom. So they get, per hour, there'd be 2.5 praise statements from the teacher. So that's not even for each kid, like just general praise statements. And so we think about like effective classroom management and we think about like the effect of that on our kids. We want to think about like identifying teaching expectations, engaging kids. These all have really powerful effects, positive effects on kids and their learning. What has a negative effect on kids is problematic behavior, both for students that are exhibiting it, as well as students that are in a classroom with a lot of problematic behavior that's chaotic. So if I'm in a classroom, again, I have a student that's experiencing challenge and I find a lot of these things are not happening. These are all opportunities to shore up that intervention. And so we have another resource here, just another one pager, a way to kind of self-assess, like, are we doing all these things? Teachers can use it on themselves. We can use it as an interview, but just a way to look at opportunities for where we can shore up that behavior supports to support our students a little bit more. So behavior support may be an issue. The other issue I want to talk a little bit about, because I think this is really important, is this idea of generalization. We have students, again, that will learn and be successful in that intervention, but they won't take it across context back to their classroom. And we want to think about how we support those kids. And so what we typically do is something like this for kids in need of intervention. We have a schedule, and your schedule may look something a little bit like this, but what we typically do is we put an intervention somewhere. And I'm not going to talk about like what comes off the plate, where you put that. There's different ways to do that, but we give the student a reading intervention. And what we do is we give that reading intervention and we change that half hour, 45 minutes of a student's day, but we don't change the other 5 hours of a student's day. We do all the things that we've been doing. And we expect that half hour to 45 minutes is going to make a huge difference in that student's trajectory. And for some students it will, but for our students with the most intensive needs, that will not be enough, because they're not going to be able to take what they learned in that isolated setting and apply it across the day, because they haven't been supported to be able to do that. It's like the idea of, like, if I go to the doctor and the doctor tells me, my blood pressure's off, I need to get my weight under control, my cholesterol's too high. Doctor tells me I need to exercise half hour a day. Great. I'm going to go out and I'm going to exercise half hour every day. And I do that religiously. I'm really good about it. Got my half hour exercise a day, but I don't change any of my other habits. I still eat the same diet, unhealthy diet I've been eating. I'm not active the other like 23 and a half hours a day. I maybe have some other bad habits. That half hour exercise a day ain't going to change your life trajectory. Like, may help a little bit, but you need a lifestyle change, right? And that's what our kids with the most intensive needs need. They need a lifestyle change. They need a supportive environment that's going to help them apply those skills across their day, not just in a half hour setting. All right. So before we move on to kind of like what are some of the things, then specific ideas of what we could do once we know, like, is it the instruction, is it the curriculum, is it the environment? Just in the chat real quick, just share kind of one resource, idea, one nugget, something that you heard that you might be able to use or to think more deeply about the instruction, the curriculum, and the environment with your school or the schools that you work with. So something that kind of just jumped out at you as being relevant for you. And if you prefer, you could also come off mute and say that too. And Nicole, praise and opportunities to respond. Yeah. Yeah, and those are easy ones, right? Like, they don't require a program. They don't require a whole lot of changing the system. They just require us to be more mindful about what we're doing. Yeah, opportunities to respond. Yes. Yeah, with adult learners as well. Yeah, has the skill been generalized? Yes, I think we miss that a lot. We teach in isolation, but we don't help kids generalize skills. Yeah, and the relationships, we underestimate that. Yep, feel valued and capable to do much better. Yeah, lots of positive feedback is important. Yeah, the role of the environment. Yeah, these are all things that go into making kids successful. And I'm not suggesting like that teachers don't do these things or don't have intentions to do these things, but there's a lot, right? Teachers have 25, 30, sometimes more kids in front of them. It's hard to be conscious about all these things when you're dealing with that, and sometimes you're just trying to get to the next period or your next break because things are challenging. And so the idea is with kids with the most intensive needs, we really need to refocus and think more deeply and purposefully about, are we doing these things, or are there areas where we could shore those up? Right? Okay. So as we think about then, how do we link this data or information that we collect to an intervention? We think about, there's some options about things we could change. And there's a resource that the NCII has called the Taxonomy of Intervention Intensity. Sounds very important and official. But really, it's just a way of saying, like, what are some of the dimensions of an intervention that we could change in order to make our kids more successful? And so I'm going to talk through each of these. So strength, dosage, alignment, attention to transfer, comprehensiveness, behavioral support, and individualization. So where do these fit in? And so really it goes back to, what's your hypothesis, right? When you think it might be this, then it leads you to do some certain things. And so if we think our hypothesis is that at that very basic level, students flatlining, there's a mismatch between what we're teaching and what they need. I've collected some diagnostic data, doesn't seem to be a good fit. If that's the case, it's really about adapting the alignment. We want to match that intervention better to students' needs. And how do we do that? And so I'm not going to go through all these because, again, you have these slides, but here's some things that you want to think about, right? Like, we want to focus more time on the specific skills that they need. We might supplement that intervention. We might look at, are we at the right level of the instructional hierarchy, and adapt that instruction to make sure that's matching the need. We also want to think about specific language and content needs. And this is going to be important with all students in particular, but especially for our multilingual learners. Like, are we using consistent language that is clear? And are we building kids' content knowledge on top of, building those foundational reading skills that they might need? Sometimes we tend to over-focus on phonics, phonemic awareness. Not that those aren't important. We have to do those. But we also need to continue to build content knowledge. Just because kids can't read at that grade level doesn't mean they can't think at grade level, and they still need that rich language to develop. So we might want to look at how we're aligning our instruction to meet those needs, both in the core instruction as well as the intervention. And so a couple resources for you here you can take a look at later. This one came out just this past year. It's a resource from Regional Educational Labs funded through the Institute for Education Sciences, but a way to diagnostically look at screening data and match your screening data to an instructional need for students. So do kids need basic phonics, phonemic awareness, fluency, or language, and then some activities. There's some links to some videos too as well of how you might teach some of those things. And then the instructional hierarchy, again, I think that's a super helpful one sometime, just to draw back and think, where does a student need a little bit more support, right? That's curriculum. So if we look at instruction, we say the intensity is not enough. Kids need more of this. Like, how do we provide more of this? There's a few ways you can go about that. And so you can increase the strength of an intervention program. You can increase the dosage, which is the amount, the opportunities, respond, and feedback, or you could make it more explicit. And so what are some ways to do that? And so with strength, really comes down to looking at a different intervention or a more effective intervention. So one with a higher effect size. Typically, this is not where I would start. If you have good evidence-based programs, don't immediately just jump to another program, because you could actually create curricular chaos with kids going from program to program. But you may need to look at different programs that might be a little bit more effective. And so National Center for Intensive Intervention has a tools chart that helps you evaluate the research behind programs to see if what you're using is research and evidence-based, particularly for the populations of students that you're using them with. So you can do strength, dosage, which is really just a fancy word for the amount of intervention that you're giving. And this is where opportunities respond come in. You can increase the minutes per session, the number of sessions, reduce the group size, but it all comes down to getting kids more practice. I like this quote from Sharon Vaughn and Jack Fletcher: "Deliberate, structured, and sustained practice is the magic that provides opportunity for success." Like, how do you build that in? Like if you can't get any more time in your schedule, let's try and get more opportunities for kids to practice those skills within the time that you have. And so some resources for adjusting that. I like this one in particular. This is strategies for scheduling. Provides a little bit of guidance for how do we build in more opportunities? How do we schedule that in? Because it's not always about like finding another intervention time. It might be finding some hidden minutes in the day. It might be intensifying within the intervention period, but it gives you some nice tips and strategies for how to think about building in more practice, given like the trickiness of scheduling sometimes. And then the assessment of the opportunities to respond. I think this is a helpful one in really starting to understand first, like, are we providing a lot of opportunities to respond, or could we beef that up? That's dosage. And the last one is just comprehensiveness, which is comprehensiveness is really just a fancy word for explicitness. Like, can we increase how explicit we are? So all of those things that go into explicit instructional sequence around breaking steps down, making sure that we have requisite background knowledge before we teach higher order skills. One of the best indicators of how well kids learn something new is how much of it they already know. Do they have stores of knowledge that they can build on to build that new knowledge and make connections? It's much harder to learn something that you know nothing about than something that you have a little bit of background on. So how can we provide a little bit of background knowledge for them to build on? Visual aids, graphic organizers, those are also super helpful for, again, all students, but multilingual learners especially. Like, how do we build different ways for students to gain information? And then providing distributed practice across the day. I touched on that with the transfer issue, but sometimes we try and cram all the practice into like a 30-minute session and we don't do any throughout the rest of the day. And you've all probably had the experience of, like me, of, in college or high school, you stay up the night before a test and you try and cram all the information in. Doesn't work as well as actually like studying throughout the weeks before and like getting a little bit of distributed practice. Not always the most responsible and thing that we do when we're younger, but it is the better thing to do in terms of learning, is to spread that learning out over time in small chunks rather than to do it all at once. And so in terms of resources, there are some modules on the National Center for Intensive Intervention around explicit instruction, just some ways to kind of do some of these steps. There's videos, there's modeling of it there. So if you need some support with that, there's some resources there. And then the last one is thinking about like, well, what if the student's just not transferring skills across settings? So it's the instructional environment, like they're learning it here, but they're not transferring it. Then it really becomes an issue of how do we assist them in generalizing and attending to transfer. And so the things that we can do, a big one is aligning your instructional routines and language across the tiers of instruction or across the classrooms. A lot of the times we tend to, we work in isolation, and we have, as teachers, we have different language for the same thing. And we may know what that means, but kids don't. So for example, I always use the example of like the silent E. Sometimes it's the silent E, sometimes it's the bossy E, sometimes it's the ninja E. Like, we get that that's all the same thing, but kids don't. And so when you're saying it different ways, they think it's something different. They don't make that connection. And so there's not a right one. It's just like, if you're going to call it silent E, call it that in every classroom. Use the same instructional language so kids don't have to spend their working memory and attention on figuring out like, okay, how do I learn here? And it's different than I learn here. Like, make those routines and language pretty similar across the context that kids have. But also, you have to teach kids how to use those strategies. Like, if I'm teaching them, again, a multisyllabic word decoding routine, I need to teach them how to identify like when they see those words and then what to do. And one thing that's actually, I'm on another project where we're starting to do this specifically for multisyllabic words, is this last one around visual scaffolds. So we're creating a toolkit for middle school teachers around reading instruction. And we've created and provided little bookmarks for kids that go through the steps of decoding a multisyllabic word. It's a routine that they've been taught, but it's a reminder of, I'm going to circle the prefix and suffix, I'm going to underline the syllables. And the kids have reported that it's super helpful to be able to take that to their classrooms because it helps them remember what they can do when they come to an unknown multisyllabic word. And so how do we provide some scaffolds for kids to take those intervention skills out across the context that they're going to learn in? All right. And so again, I think the resources, the strategies for scheduling is a nice attention to transfer one because it tells you how to build in opportunities to respond and practice throughout your day, not just in that intervention period. All right. And then the last one here is environment. If we really truly think that there are additional classroom or behavior management needs, so we know students with significant reading challenges, especially as they get older, will typically have some behavioral or social emotional issues that go along with that. Because for many kids, like as they get older, who can't read, they'll learn that it's better for me to act out and get kicked out of class than it is for me to try and read out loud and show that I can't read. That's that's just a choice that they make. And so we want to make sure that if kids have significant behavioral issues that are getting in the way of instruction, that we're addressing those. Or if kids have social emotional issues that go along, anxiety, depression, other things that go along with those reading challenges, we want to address those as well. We don't just want to fix, the reading issues. We want to make sure that we're addressing the mental health of our students as well. And so in order to do that, we can look at some behavioral, academic, social, emotional, integrating supports to make sure that we're really providing support for all of our students' needs, not just some of them. And so some of the things we can do just around like behavioral supports, obviously, number one, we want to teach kids expectations and reinforce those expectations. So that involves providing modeling, guided practice, and independent practice around actually meeting those expectations. But making sure that we're using like different ways to address behavioral issues and social emotional supports as well. All right. So as we look at all those, then there's really a menu of options here in terms of what we can provide for students and what we can adapt. And so the idea is it's not one size fits all. DBI is a process about figuring out what students need on the front end in terms of, is it instruction, is it curriculum, is it the environment, and then using some resources to adapt the right things. And I would say as we adapt these interventions, we want to make the most minimal amount of adaptations as we possibly can that's going to have the most impact. So what that means is I don't want to have a student that's experiencing challenges and we decide, well, we're going to increase the opportunities to respond. We're going to align all our instructional routines. We're going to implement a different curriculum. We're going to implement a behavior system. We're going to get a different, like, you're not going to do all that. Like, you may have the best intentions, but it's not going to be implemented well. So if we have a student who's making some progress, but it's not enough, maybe we start with, let's build in more opportunities to respond within their intervention. And maybe we work on helping them transfer those skills to their other contexts that they're learning in as well. So do a couple things, 2 to 3 changes that are going to have a large impact on kids instead of trying to fix, all of these things all at once. So, all right. And so a final kind of set of resources here, just for intervention adaptations. So basically these provide just a list of kind of things to consider in terms of when we're intensifying. It's a lot of the things that I talked about, just like strategies and skills and things you can do, but we often get asked for, it's like, is there a list of things that we can try? Like, well, yes, here's a list of things you can try, but it's a list of things that we want to make sure that we're trying with fidelity and actually doing. What I see sometimes is these get used as just check boxes where a teacher will look at and go, yep, I do this, I do this, I do that, I do this. And maybe you do, but we really want to be intentional about what we're doing. And if we say, we need to better align instructional practices across contexts, like, let's have a conversation about that and actually make sure that we're following through on that. So some ideas for how to intensify, and then the document on the right is just some information and ideas about how do we make sure that we're considering the needs of our multilingual learner population, because there are some different things that we need to consider around language, acculturation, that we may not need to consider as much for some of our native English speakers who have been here their entire academic careers. So just some things to think about as we support all of our students and teachers in terms of adapting and intensifying instruction for what they need. So, all right. So that kind of is all that I have. I know that's kind of a lot, but really, I think within thinking about this, I think the easy way to do it is break it down into manageable chunks and start to think through just at the very basic level through that lens of instruction, curriculum, environment, and starting to think through like changing mindsets around the idea of really using that goldfish analogy of not blaming students and starting to think through when students are experiencing challenges, at this level of support, what can we do? What are those alterable variables? Really taking a look in the mirror system wide and saying, what can we change around the instruction, the curriculum, and the environment? So I'm going to pause there and just see kind of what questions or general thoughts have popped up. And you can put them in the chat or you can come off mute as well.
John, that was a lot of great information. I do have a question. When you think about like when you shared about the 2.5 praises per hour, it's like a little overwhelming to think about that. Like I understand like what it would look like. You would want to get more praise before we're asking students to do more things. What would it look like to actually like have 10 opportunities in that minute of time? Like I'm just trying to imagine like a teacher going from 1 or 2 opportunities to respond in an hour maybe to like 10. And I hear what you're saying, like a little bit at a time, but
Yeah.
maybe some tips would be helpful for people to think about.
Yeah. And I think it's if you like, I would recommend one way to see some good examples of this. If you've ever seen like Anita Archer teach, I know her website, if you go to explicitinstruction.org, she has some videos on there of some like routines that she teaches. It's actually going to share one today, but had some tech issues, wasn't able to do it. But the idea, like we're going through a sequence, and a lot of good, programs have this built in, like good explicit programs. So it's like if we're doing basic decoding skills, basically it's the I do, we do sequence. The words, the sounds in sad are sad. Do it with me. Add. What word? Sad. Let's do it again. What word? Add. Sad. All right, next word. Like you can go through a word list pretty quickly and get some repetition there. But again, like if students make mistakes, that's an opportunity to go back and have them do it again. That's another opportunity to respond. So I think it's just like, instead of just going on and again, like the routine was like teacher asks them to do something, they do it, then we just ask them to do something else without acknowledging it. Like acknowledge the correct answer as well. Like a lot of times we only acknowledge incorrect answers, but also saying, yes, that word is sad. Say it again. What word? Sad. Everyone, what word? Sad. Like they just got 3 opportunities to practice that in about 5 seconds. And the more you hear that, the more you do that correctly, it gets really ingrained in you as you hear that. So I mean, I had an advisor in graduate school that used to say like opportunities respond follows the law of chocolate, in that more is better. And so it's not like you don't have to get to 10 right away, but what are you at now? Let's get more. Like let's build in more. And so I think if and I've seen, I was just at a training last week where there was a whole school that was their instructional focus for the year, increasing opportunities to respond. And so if you focus on it, you can change it. And if you change it, it has a large impact on kids. Again, it's a pretty easy thing to move if you really focus on increasing those instructional opportunities. The one caveat to that, I would say, is make sure that you're also tracking correct responses, because it's not just enough to say like, oh, well, we asked them more questions. Like, well, are they getting them correct? Because if they're not getting them correct, then they're practicing errors more. So, but yeah, I would say look at those Anita Archer videos. She does a really nice job of building those in and sharing like different ways to do that. She's even got some like middle school science, middle school math. Like there's a lot of different ways to build in opportunities to respond.
Can I add to that, John, too?
Yeah.
So I have been doing a couple of lessons in classrooms, and I'm just having the teacher or whoever's there. There was a parent one time and they were tallying how many OTRs I was doing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really helpful too, just to get a sense of like, where am I at right now? And and how far do I need to stretch myself? So just grabbing somebody from outside to come into the classroom and just tally, I found was really, really helpful.
Yeah. And I'll say too, like the OTRs, it's not only is it easy to kind of collect data on it too, but it's in terms of an instructional observation, it's very non-judgmental. Like it's not like someone coming in your classroom and be like, well, you need to improve this, you didn't do this well, this looked good. Like it's neither good nor bad. It's a number, right? Like it's just like I saw this. And so it provides a nice baseline to improve. And what I've seen with the teachers I work with, and when I was teaching interventions, it becomes kind of motivating to be like, okay, like I can get more, like I'm going to get more opportunities to practice. I'm going to get this kid practicing and this kid's going to do it. It's like, and then you come back, observe again, like I got more, like that's great. Like, but it's a very tangible thing that you can both, you can take data on, you can track it and you can improve it pretty easily if you focus on it. So, yeah. All right. What other questions or thoughts popped up for people?
John, since we said that already, we have quite a few people that maybe are going to be watching the recording later. If people had follow-up questions, how would you recommend them to, other than to click on the link in the slides and get the material? Are there resources that they could go to a person?
Yeah, so I'll put this up here. So there's NCII at AIR.org is the general one, but there's my email address too, jopotter@air.org. So you can feel free to shoot me an email if there's something that you're looking for. I will say that the NCII website, it's a bit like it's kind of like a cheesecake factory. Like there's a lot of good stuff there, but it's a lot, like it's a bit overwhelming with how much stuff there is, and it's hard to find what you want sometimes. So if you're looking for something specific and having a hard time with it, you can always reach out to me and I'll help kind of point you in the right direction. I know they're working on kind of organizing a little bit better, but usually there's something on there for everyone. So yeah. Let me go back just a second. I just want to make sure get the survey here, and I'll put the link in the chat as well here for folks. If you, whoops, why is this doing this? Yeah, there you go. All right. Nope. I don't know why it did that. Let me do it again. There you go. All right. Yeah, so if you want to click on the link, you don't have to do it like right this minute, but we appreciate the feedback data. It helps us kind of change things and make our resources and support better as well for these. So, but if there are no more questions, then I'll kind of go to the end here. And I know you guys had some just kind of final announcements for folks.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. Again, like I think about that a wide variety of options to things that we can do are the same that we're looking for ways to support kids. Just choose one and go with it, right? So in that thought, we have some upcoming learning opportunities. If you haven't already enrolled in Project Arise, we have an opportunity for you to enroll. There's a link there. Also exciting to announce that there's an opportunity to gain some continuing education units. You can get 3 units by going through all the courses. NCII's course is the final one. Encourage people to get all the way through to the end and do some additional hours and then earn the 3 units. Also there we have recordings of our fall and our spring workshops, and then upcoming our statewide virtual community of practice. And there's a link at the bottom if people want to join. Thank you all. Thank you very much to John for taking the time today. Thanks, Michelle, for organizing everything. And great to see you all.
Thanks, everyone.